You were never supposed to hear this. Not from me. Not from anyone. Because what I'm about to tell you doesn't live in textbooks or in any official archive. It hides in the margins in scorched medical journals, locked asylum records, and the whispered confessions of men who swore to carry the secret to their graves. It begins with a boy in Missouri, 1875. A boy whose very existence defied everything science claimed to understand about the human mind and about the human soul. His name was Timothy Caldwell. He was 9 years old when the first doctors examined him. They thought they were dealing with another troubled orphan, another casualty of poverty and neglect in post-war America. But Timothy's case unsettled them almost immediately. He didn't react to pain the way other children did. His pulse would slow when it should have raced. His body could mimic illness on command, fevers that rose and fell at will, tremors that vanished when he decided they should. And then there were the eyes. Cold, calculating, always searching for weakness. Not the eyes of a child. The eyes of something already older, something already practiced in the art of control. By 1875, Timothy had vanished from the Missouri State Hospital under circumstances no official report would ever explain. One night he was there sedated, strapped, watched by 3 attendants. The next morning, his bed was empty, the restraints still buckled, and the locks on his door unbroken. No escape route, no explanation. He had simply dissolved from their reality. Science had no answer. The town whispered witchcraft. The doctors muttered words like genius, savant, sociopath. None of it was enough. 7 years later, across the Kansas plains, death began to spread like a shadow that no one could name. Frail old men, widows, veterans of war, each taken by a slow, natural decline. Or so it appeared. Only one thread connected them all. A polite young caregiver who called himself Thomas Whitfield. But to the one man who had known him as a child, who had studied him, who had written page after page in trembling ink, there was no mistaking the truth. This was not Thomas. This was Timothy Caldwell, grown, sharpened, perfected. A boy science could not explain, now turned into something science could not contain. And tonight you're going to see what he became. The name Thomas Whitfield sounded harmless, trustworthy. The kind of name a widow in rural Kansas could speak with relief, believing she had finally found someone who would carry her burden with patience and care. That was the mask. A young man with good posture, a soft voice, and hands that looked too refined for farm labor, yet steady enough to measure out a spoonful of laudanum without trembling. Families described him as a gift, a blessing. They had no idea they were inviting a predator into their homes. Whitfield was the kind of man people wanted to believe in. He arrived with letters of recommendation, folded carefully in his coat pocket, written in neat, practiced handwriting. Letters that spoke of his devotion, his kindness, his miraculous ability to ease suffering. But those letters, they were forgeries, every one of them. And yet no one questioned them because in 1875 Kansas, the need for help outweighed suspicion. Families were exhausted from years of war, disease, and the endless work of survival. They wanted the comfort of believing someone young and strong could shoulder the weight. Thomas knew this. He counted on it. What the families never saw, what only a few doctors would whisper about later, was the precision behind his care. He knew exactly how long to stay before a patient declined. He knew which symptoms would mask his true hand, which conditions could be nudged without leaving a trace. And he knew how to perform grief, but only just enough. He would lower his head, bow in respect, but never shed a tear, never falter. To those who looked closer, there was something unnatural about the way he navigated death, as if he was watching it, studying it, controlling it. Behind his mask, Timothy Caldwell had evolved. He had learned that violence draws attention, but compassion disarms suspicion. He no longer needed the caves where he once mutilated animals. He no longer needed the crude experiments that filled Dr. Harding's journals with horror. Now, he could practice on living human beings, hidden in plain sight. And every time he watched another life ebb away under his care, he was learning not just about anatomy, but about control, about the frailty of human trust. Thomas Whitfield was the mask. Timothy Caldwell was the machine beneath it, a machine of silence, calculation, and appetite. And soon, that machine would grow bold enough to step beyond the dying into the living. The pattern began slowly, like the first drops of rain before a storm. A widow in Leavenworth. A farmer crippled by stroke outside Lawrence. A veteran whose mind had never returned from Antietam. Each one welcomed Thomas Whitfield into their homes, and each one left this world under his watch. First, no one noticed because who would? These were people already marked by age, by sickness, by the natural decline of flesh. Death was expected. Death was inevitable. That was Timothy's brilliance. He didn't fight inevitability. He harnessed it. He never stayed too long. 2 weeks, for weeks, maybe 6 at most. Always just enough time to appear devoted, but never long enough for suspicion to root. He moved like a ghost across the counties, leaving only grieving families who praised his kindness and recommended him to others. In this circuit of suffering, Timothy built his laboratory. Each patient was a study, each death an experiment. He adjusted variables like a physician no medical school had trained: dosage, timing, the body's resistance, the family's perception. And always, the outcome was the same: the body expired, the family wept, and Thomas Whitfield walked away untarnished. The system became so refined that he could predict the very day his patients would slip. Families remembered his warnings. Prepare yourself, it will not be long. And when the final breath came, they mistook his prediction for wisdom, never realizing it was orchestration. The county physician, Dr. Wheeler, noted the strangeness in his journals. How this young man asked too many questions about causes of death, about documentation, about what authorities looked for. Wheeler sensed it not curiosity, but calculation. And still, he found nothing to expose him. Because Timothy had designed it that way. He knew the boundaries of science better than the scientists themselves. He knew how much truth a community could handle before it cracked. This was not random cruelty. This was structure. This was discipline. Timothy was no longer the boy who carved symbols into cave walls and dismembered animals by lantern light. He had matured into something far more efficient. Violence for him was no longer an outburst, it was a craft. And behind every soft word, every gentle touch, every polite smile at the dinner table, there was the pulse of that craft, a ritual of death disguised as mercy. And if you listen closely, you can almost feel him refining it, turning it into something larger, something meant not just to kill but to teach. Killing the body was only the first step. Timothy discovered something more intoxicating: the power to rearrange the living. Once inside a home, he didn't just tend to the patient, he restructured the household itself. The families believed it was kindness. In truth, it was invasion. He understood rhythm, the cadence of meals, the subtle shifts of mood when sickness lingered too long. He would adjust his presence to those rhythms, always knowing when to offer a comforting word, when to stand silently in the corner, when to step outside and let the family believe the dying one was resting peacefully. In these carefully chosen silences, he was training them without their knowledge, training them to trust his timing, to yield their instincts to his direction. The most dangerous trick was the way he spoke of death, not as a tragedy, but as an inevitability he could help them face. Families repeated his words as though they were scripture. He's prepared us. He knew this would happen. He made it easier. In their grief, they mistook his precision for prophecy. And with every repetition, his voice burrowed deeper into their minds. Neighbors noticed how quickly households seemed to reshape themselves under his influence. Sons stopped arguing over inheritance. Wives softened their suspicions of husbands. Quarrels dissolved, not because wounds had healed, but because Timothy had absorbed the tension and redirected it. He became the axis around which families revolved. And by the time death arrived, they no longer thought of him as a stranger. He was trusted, almost beloved. Dr. Harding, who had known Timothy as a child, later wrote that this was the most chilling evolution of all. That the boy once driven by raw cruelty had discovered a higher form of control. Not over flesh, but over faith. Harding compared it to hypnosis, though he admitted it was something deeper, something no theory of the time could explain. Timothy had become a mirror for people's fears. He reflected back exactly what they needed to see: compassion, certainty, even holiness, while underneath, he studied the mechanics of their submission. This was no longer about hiding his crimes. It was about rehearsing power, perfecting a theater where grief, fear, and faith could be manipulated like instruments in his hands. And in that theater, death was no longer the climax, it was the opening act. The genius of Timothy Caldwell wasn't only in the homes he infiltrated. It was in the reflection he held up to something larger, something far older. Because when you strip away the mask of Thomas Whitfield, what you see is not just a predator, but an echo of the very systems that govern men. His cruelty was not random. It was institutional. Think of how he worked. Gain entry by appearing necessary, gain trust by easing pain, create dependency by offering certainty, then shape behavior by controlling the rhythm of life and death. Families bent to him not because he demanded it, but because they believed it was their choice. That is the same blueprint empires have always used, from kings cloaked in divine right, to churches whispering salvation, to governments promising order in exchange for obedience. He was not outside civilization. He was civilization distilled to its most dangerous purity. The county doctors who noticed his strange precision, the officials who signed his death certificates, they weren't blind. They were conditioned. They looked at patterns of suffering, shook their heads and said, "Such is life." Isn't that the same phrase institutions feed to the masses? Work until your bones break. Pay your dues. Obey your rulers. Such is life. The brilliance of Timothy's system was that it didn't need chains or threats. It needed trust. It needed people to hand over their will willingly. And make no mistake, he was learning from them as much as they were yielding to him. Every whispered confession of a grieving widow, every frightened glance from a son preparing for his father's death, every prayer uttered in desperation, he absorbed it. He was building a private archive of human weakness, a secret library of the ways men bend when they fear loss, when they fear uncertainty. Dr. Harding once said that what made Timothy terrifying was not his crimes, but his lesson. That Timothy Caldwell was proof a single man could replicate the control of institutions within a single household. If he could master that on a small scale, what might he become on a larger one? You see, Timothy was not just killing. He was rehearsing empire. At first, his methods seemed practical, discreet, efficient, almost invisible. But over time, something began to change. Timothy no longer treated each death as merely an experiment. He began to shape them, polish them, give them rhythm. He was turning murder into ritual. Families remembered how he insisted on silence during certain hours of the night, how he dimmed lamps, how he positioned the patient's body with unusual care, arranging arms and blankets as though staging a tableau. He spoke less in those final days, his voice dropping to a whisper, his gaze fixed on the dying with something that looked like fascination or worship. Some households described him kneeling at the bedside, head bowed, as if in prayer. Others recalled finding him in the kitchen long after midnight, not sleeping, just sitting at the table with his hands folded, listening to the house breathe. These were not the habits of a caregiver. They were rehearsals. Each gesture carried a weight beyond function, a cadence meant for him alone. The dying became his congregation, their families his witnesses, the home itself a sacred chamber. What had begun as a method of concealment had mutated into something Timothy himself seemed bound to. He wasn't just killing, he was creating moments, ceremonies of departure, where he alone was the conductor of the final breath. And those moments fed him. You could see it in how he lingered. He never rushed death. He sculpted it, bent it into form, like a sculptor molding clay. His predictions grew eerily precise, not just the day, but the hour. Prepare yourself. Tonight it will be over. And it was. Families believed he possessed a divine gift. They said his presence eased their loved ones into peace. What they didn't realize was that Timothy was writing his own liturgy, a private religion where he was priest, physician, and executioner. Dr. Harding would later call this the ascension of his appetite. Violence was no longer a means of expression. It was a sacrament. Every life he extinguished was an offering, Every family's grief a confirmation of his dominion. He wasn't just practicing medicine or mimicking institutions. He was building a ritual of control, a dark empire of the spirit, rehearsed in kitchens and bedrooms across Kansas. And once ritual took hold, Timothy could never go back. He was no longer content with experiments. He wanted worship. When Timothy left a household, his absence was never clean. Families thought they were simply returning to their routines, but something remained, something they couldn't put words to. The rooms felt altered, heavier, as though his presence had soaked into the walls. Survivors spoke of dreams that haunted them, dreams where Timothy stood at the bedside again, silent, watching. Others swore they heard the sound of his footsteps weeks after he had gone, the floorboards creaking in the same rhythm he once paced at night. But the deepest scar wasn't supernatural. It was psychological. Timothy understood the exact words to plant in the minds of the living, sentences that would loop in their thoughts long after he departed. You did all you could. This was the way it had to be. Your loved one was waiting for release. Families repeated these words to themselves like mantras, unable to separate their own voice from his. He had scripted their grief, engineered their memories so they would never suspect him, only thank him. But beneath the gratitude lay dependency, because once you've been guided through death by someone who seemed to understand it better than anyone alive, who else can you trust? Wives would later admit that they missed his calm voice in the house. Sons confessed that no preacher or doctor could console them the way Thomas Whitfield had. A few even sought him out again, writing letters to neighbors, asking if anyone knew where he had gone. He had turned their mourning into loyalty. Even in death, he remained their guide. This was the scar. Not just loss, but the feeling that they couldn't endure loss without him. Timothy had infected them with reliance. He had shown them that death could be managed, choreographed, softened, but only through his hand. And so when he vanished, they felt not only grief for their loved one, but grief for him. He became entangled in their mourning, a phantom who walked with them long after the funeral dirt had hardened. Dr. Harding saw it clearly. He wrote, "Caldwell does not kill a man and leave the family behind. He takes the family with him, binding them to his image, haunting their conscience as though he were still present. He kills twice, once in the flesh and again in the soul." Timothy wasn't just ending lives anymore. He was writing himself into memory, branding himself into the psyche of every family he touched. By the summer of 1875, whispers began to stir beyond the farmhouses and rural kitchens. Timothy's trail of care was too clean, too consistent. The county physicians who signed the death certificates felt the unease but lacked evidence. The pastors who delivered funeral sermons found themselves unsettled by the way families spoke of their mysterious caregiver, not with sorrow, but with reverence. And in every town he passed through, a residue lingered, a faint unease that suggested something unnatural had brushed against the community. Church elders noted that families stopped attending services during his stay, choosing instead to gather around the dying one's bedside under Thomas's silent supervision. To some ministers, this felt like heresy, as though a stranger had usurped their sacred role. He offered no scripture, no doctrine, yet his presence carried an authority even faith could not compete with. He made the passage gentle, the families would say, their voices trembling with gratitude. And the pastors, who had spent years comforting the dying with words of heaven, felt their own authority unravel. The doctors were no less shaken. Dr. Wheeler recorded his suspicions in terse, private notes. He knows too much. He asks what should not interest a caregiver. He prepares the families too well. There is purpose in him. Yet Wheeler, like the others, could find nothing to pin down. Every death had precedent, every symptom matched a textbook decline. Timothy understood their blind spots better than they did. He walked through their institutions like smoke, ungraspable and proven. Even lawmen felt the chill. In one county, the sheriff remarked on how many death notices bore the same signature: Thomas Whitfield, caregiver. He joked about it at first until he realized the numbers stretched beyond coincidence. But suspicion without evidence is nothing. Timothy knew that. He relied on it. Just as institutions depend on the silence of the people they govern, Timothy thrived in the silence between suspicion and proof. Dr. Harding later reflected that what frightened him most was not Timothy's cruelty, but his mimicry. He resembled the institutions themselves, Harding wrote. The church, the physician, the law, each unable to confront him, because he operated with their same tools: trust, certainty, inevitability. He had become a mirror too sharp to look at directly. Timothy Caldwell was no longer just haunting families. He was haunting the very structures meant to protect them. Something shifted in Timothy that summer. He had perfected the mask, refined the ritual, branded himself into memory, and now he wanted more. He no longer seemed satisfied with invisibility. Instead, he began to stage his power, to test how far he could push the world around him without consequence. What had once been subtle became theatrical. Neighbors noticed the way he carried himself now, not just as a caregiver but as a man who owned the air in a room. At funerals, he stood apart from the family, his head bowed, his hands folded like a priest, and yet his posture suggested command, as though the service itself bent to his silent will. He lingered longer in towns, appearing in public places where whispers of his reputation preceded him. People greeted him with respect, even admiration. Some said he radiated calm. Others admitted, in hushed voices, that his presence was unsettling, too composed, too certain, too untouched by grief. And then there were the demonstrations. Families reported moments that bordered on the uncanny. Timothy predicting the exact hour of a final breath, only for the patient to expire as though on cue. Or speaking in quiet tones about what the body would do next. There will be a pause. Then the breath will grow shallow. Then silence will come, and watching as his words unfolded in real time. To the grieving, it felt like prophecy. To the suspicious, it looked like control. But Timothy reveled in their confusion. It was theater, yes, but theater with teeth. Because the more dramatic his precision became, the more impossible it was for anyone to confront him. Families saw the spectacle and called it a gift. Ministers saw it and called it providence. Doctors saw it and called it coincidence. And Timothy saw it for what it truly was: dominance. Dr. Harding wrote that by this stage, Timothy was no longer experimenting with death, he was orchestrating audiences. He wanted witnesses. He wanted awe. He wanted to prove that he could bend reality itself, and no institution, no authority, could stop him. And this, Harding warned, was the most dangerous transformation of all. The moment when a hidden predator believes himself untouchable. Because once a man feels invincible, the theater never stops at the edge of the stage. It grows. It hungers. Consumes. By the autumn of 1876, Timothy's fascination with orchestrating death had sharpened into something even more dangerous. Death alone was no longer enough. The predictable decline of the sick and the frail gave him control, yes, but it was limited, preordained. He began to wonder, could he bend the living the way he bent the dying? Could he orchestrate not just the final act, but the entire play? Survivors of his care began to notice peculiar patterns. Widows, still raw with grief, reported that Timothy returned to check in weeks after their loved one's burial. His words were soft, measured, always cloaked in the guise of kindness, yet they carried an undertow. Families found themselves deferring to him in decisions that had nothing to do with sickness or death. Whether to sell land, whether to take in boarders, whether to marry again. They described it later as if their grief had rewired them to follow his voice, as though his presence became an anchor they couldn't refuse. And children, too, were not spared. Harding documented stories of youngsters left in Timothy's company who emerged changed, quiet, obedient, their gazes lowered, as if something in them had been broken down and reassembled. One boy told his mother that Mr. Whitfield had taught him how to practice being still, like the dying do. To the family it seemed harmless, even thoughtful. To Harding, it was chilling. Timothy had begun rehearsing mortality in the living. His influence reached beyond homes into the broader community. In one village, when a mill worker collapsed in the fields, Timothy stepped forward before the doctor could arrive, commanding the crowd to stand back. He held the man's head, whispered to him, and when the worker revived minutes later, Timothy's reputation as a healer spread like fire. People began to invite him not only into their deaths, but into their lives. What terrified Harding most was how effortless it became. Timothy no longer needed to conceal himself. The living sought him out. The dying submitted to him, and both left their encounters marked. He had crossed the threshold, Harding wrote. The dead were his stage, but the living had become his chorus. He was no longer only guiding passages into silence. He was rehearsing control over life itself. By the winter of 1876, Timothy's methods had crystallized into something more deliberate, more ritualistic. Harding described it as a forked path, two parallel sermons unfolding, each with its own doctrine. One preached obedience, the other preached annihilation, and together, they formed the core of what Harding would later call Timothy's private liturgy. The first ritual was subtle, almost invisible, obedience. Timothy began cultivating the living not just through suggestion, but through conditioning. He prized silence, stillness, submission. Families who hosted him noticed how quickly their children quieted in his presence, how easily their elders deferred to his judgment. He trained households to move around him like parishioners before an altar, not commanded, but guided into alignment. Survivors recalled that he never raised his voice, never gave direct orders. Instead, he demonstrated the way to sit, the way to breathe, the way to accept inevitability. He made us practice death without dying, one woman confessed years later. But the second ritual was darker, rooted in annihilation. Timothy still presided over the dying, but now his hand lingered too long, his timing too precise. He began cutting life shorter than fate intended, his control slipping from observation into orchestration. In one case, Harding noted, Timothy prepared the family by describing how the end would come at midnight. When the clock struck 12, he pressed the pillow down. The family, paralyzed by his certainty, did nothing. They later swore it was God's will. Timothy had not only killed, he had converted the act into ceremony. Harding likened the contrast to two rival sermons preached by the same minister. The first trained the living into submission. The second rehearsed death as spectacle. Both relied on the same tools: silence, inevitability, reverence. Both left scars. And both deepened Timothy's conviction that he was no longer a man moving through the world, but something larger, a presence, an authority, an institution unto himself. By this stage, Timothy no longer needed the church, the doctor, or the law as shadows to hide within. He had replicated their functions in miniature: comforter, executioner, judge. His empire was not land or wealth, it was ritual, carved into the flesh and memory of every family he touched. His genius, Harding wrote, was not in the act of killing. It was in convincing the living that they had witnessed something holy, even as their lives were dismantled in front of them. By the spring of 1877, Timothy no longer distinguished between his two liturgies. What began as parallel rituals, obedience for the living, annihilation for the dying, began to collapse into one system. Submission was no longer just training, it was preparation. The living became rehearsal for the dead. Families who fell under his care found that the lines blurred. He instructed children to practice the stillness, lying motionless for hours in their beds, breathing shallowly, waiting for his nod of approval. At first, parents mistook it for discipline, a quieting influence on restless youth. But later, those same children described it as dread, as though each practice session was a rehearsal for their own disappearance. Widows and mothers, too, found themselves entranced by his presence. When Timothy pressed them to sell their land, to abandon old ties, to trust his judgment entirely, they complied without hesitation. Harding recorded one testimony in which a woman confessed she would have walked into her husband's grave if Mr. Whitfield had asked it of her. Timothy had dissolved the barrier between loyalty and surrender. And then, in the deaths themselves, the fusion became unmistakable. Families would be trained knowingly or not to anticipate the precise moment, to sit silently as the last breaths unfolded exactly as Timothy described. Their obedience ensured their complicity. By the time his hand pressed the pillow, by the time he cut short the final gasp, the ritual was already complete. None moved, none spoke, None resisted. They had been prepared too well. Harding reflected on this phase with horror. He no longer needed to kill in secret. The households themselves became his congregation. The living rehearsed their own deaths, and when the appointed hour came, they accepted it as inevitable, as righteous. He had fused comfort with cruelty, submission with silence, care with annihilation. What terrified Harding most was not just the murders, but the permanence of the scars left behind. Survivors carried Timothy's rituals with them long after he was gone. Some could never sit in silence again without trembling. Some described an inability to resist commands from authority figures, as if their will had been hollowed out. Families broken by him remained broken for generations, their memories of his presence shaping the way they taught their children about death, obedience, and fear. Timothy had perfected what institutions had only hinted at, not just control of the body, but colonization of the soul. By 1878, the contagion was no longer limited to families. Whole towns began to bear Timothy's mark without even realizing it. His influence spread not like a man's presence, but like a plague invisible, yet shaping everything it touched. Where he had lingered, entire communities began to mimic his rituals without naming them. Neighbors whispered of the quiet homes, places where the curtains stayed drawn, where families seemed subdued, almost monastic. Children who had once played in the fields now sat indoors in silence, trained by Timothy's stillness exercises. Women wore black long before their husbands died, as though mourning was no longer a reaction but a preparation. Men drank less, spoke less, accepted decline without protest, repeating Timothy's phrases as though they were prayers. The body knows when it is finished. The kindest act is to let it rest. Dr. Harding, horrified, described this as the spread of communal obedience. It was no longer about individual murders. It was about a climate of resignation, a shared acceptance of decline, death, and silence as virtues. Timothy had infected towns with his logic, turning resistance into sin, struggle into shame, and surrender into the highest form of righteousness. The contagion spread through testimony, through gossip, through admiration. Families who had hosted Timothy spoke of him with reverence. His name became a charm. Whitfield helped us let go. He knew the hour. He gave us peace. That phrase, "he gave us peace," echoed across counties like scripture. And beneath it all lay a darker truth. Timothy was no longer just one man orchestrating deaths. He was becoming an idea. His methods were being replicated unknowingly by others' daughters who smothered mothers because they believed it was merciful, sons who withheld food because they believed it was time, neighbors who counseled resignation rather than struggle. The contagion of ritual had become decentralized. Timothy's empire no longer required his direct presence. Communities carried his shadow in their practices, their silence, their expectations of one another. Harding called it a spiritual infection, one more insidious than plague, because the sick begged for its continuation. And you, listener, ask yourself, when an idea moves like this, when death becomes a communal ritual dressed in mercy, are we still talking about murder, or are we talking about doctrine? Doctrine that outlives the man who whispered it first. Doctrine that shapes generations. Doctrine you can feel even now, in the quiet expectations society presses into you. The summer of 1879 brought the moment Harding had long feared. The contagion no longer stayed contained within households. It broke open into public tragedy, and the line between Timothy's hand and the will of entire communities blurred into horror. It began in Douglas County, in a farming village that had welcomed Timothy months earlier. He had cared for an aging patriarch, a Civil War veteran with half a lung and trembling hands. The man died, of course, precisely when Timothy said he would. But what lingered behind was not grief. It was discipline. The family and then the neighbors began to repeat Timothy's instructions as if they were gospel. The stillness exercises, the preparation of the body for release. The whispered belief that death was not an enemy but an order to be obeyed. Within weeks, something unspeakable happened. When a fever swept through the town, families did not resist. They did not fight, they did not call doctors, they did not pray for deliverance. They prepared. Parents laid their children in bed, instructing them to breathe shallow, to hold still, to welcome the silence. And when the children stopped breathing, there was no panic, no screaming, only quiet nods, as though the ritual had reached its natural conclusion. Harding arrived too late. He described the scene in words that crackle like a curse. Whole homes lay in silence. Infants in cradles, fathers in chairs, women on floors, all arranged in dreadful order. The windows sealed, the doors barred, not against intrusion but against interruption. It was not suicide. It was not disease. It was doctrine acted out, the ritual carried to its end. Whitfield's hand was nowhere present, yet everywhere visible. That was Timothy's final victory. His presence was no longer required. He had dissolved himself into the very psychology of a town. Death arrived as a choice disguised as compassion, and obedience itself became annihilation. This was the climax, not the tally of bodies, but the proof of principle. Timothy had shown how an idea, whispered through grief, dressed as mercy, could reorganize an entire community into silence. His killings had become redundant. The infection itself now killed in his stead. Harding never recovered from what he saw. He wrote, "We chase men who swing knives, who load pistols, who light fires. We do not know how to chase an idea that convinces its hosts to die willingly. That is not a crime scene. That is a liturgy. And if you think this ended in 1879, you are wrong. The tragedy of that Kansas town was not the end, it was the blueprint. A test. A revelation of how easily obedience, silence, and doctrine can metastasize into catastrophe when a man like Timothy pulls the first thread. After Douglas County, the trail of Timothy Caldwell, the boy science could not explain, the man mercy could not restrain, vanishes into silence. No record marks his death. No grave holds his body. No court ever tried him. Harding chased rumors, followed whispers into Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska. Each time he found only echoes. Families who still practiced the stillness. Towns where silence was praised more than struggle. Graves where the dates lined too neatly, too obediently to be coincidence. Timothy himself had dissolved, not into dust, but into memory, into practice, into doctrine. That is the haunting truth. Some monsters end in a noose. Timothy became something worse. A lesson absorbed into culture. A reminder that death can wear the mask of kindness. That obedience can be rehearsed until it feels like faith. That the most dangerous killers do not swing axes in the night, they whisper ideas that live on when their bodies are gone. Harding's last words on the case were not about Timothy. They were about us. What he revealed was not his power, but our weakness. How quickly we bend to authority. How easily we exchange will for peace. How willingly we practice our own annihilation, so long as someone teaches us to call it mercy. And here is where you, listener, cannot escape. Because Timothy Caldwell is not history. He is method. He is blueprint. He is the shadow cast whenever you accept silence where resistance is required. He is present whenever you let institutions dictate your limits, your body, your breath, your hour of surrender. If you have listened this far, you are not the same man you were when you pressed play. You cannot unknow this. And to anchor that truth in you, to mark the descent as permanent, I will ask you to do something. In the comments below, write these words twice. I will not practice silence. That phrase is the break in the ritual. It is the signal that you understand what Timothy taught and that you refuse to be rehearsed for your own annihilation. Do not let this be just a story of a boy in 1875. Let it be a mirror. Let it be a warning. Let it be the sound of chains snapping in your mind. Because the infection that began in Kansas has no date of death. Its shadow waits in every system that tells you silence is peace. Surrender is virtue. Obedience is holy. Timothy is gone. But the ritual remains. And now you know it. You've heard the story. You've seen how a single boy became an infection, how silence became doctrine, and how obedience hollowed entire towns into graves. And now you know this was never just about Timothy Caldwell. It was about us. About how easily a man's will can be rehearsed for surrender. If you have walked this far with me, then you are not the same man who began this descent. You cannot unhear it. You cannot unsee it. The only question is whether you carry it forward or whether you slip back into silence like the rest. So I'll ask you to mark this moment. Below this video, write the phrase twice. I will not practice silence. Twice, because the ritual must be broken in both word and echo. Those who write it declare themselves awake. Those who do not remain part of the congregation Timothy built. And if you are strong enough for more forbidden history, more truths no institution wants whispered, then subscribe now. Not for me, but for yourself. Because the deeper descents are coming, and only those who stand ready will walk them. This is where the story ends. But your awakening begins.